The sun beat down on the wooden planks of the auction platform, turning dust to heat and silence to weight. Flies circled the rim of an empty whiskey glass, and a pair of dogs fought over a scrap of jerky in the alley beyond. No one laughed loud. Only the kind of laughter that dies in the throat, tight, biting, laced with meanness. She was dragged forward with a rope around her wrists and a sack on her head, tied at the neck like grain. Her dress was torn along one sleeve, hem muddied and frayed. Whoever she'd once been had long disappeared beneath filth and silence. The men leaned forward like vultures. One spat. Another muttered, "She'll do for cookin', or somethin'." The auctioneer's voice was slick with sweat and habit. "Damaged goods, fellas, but she's got hands and hips. Startin' at $2, any takers?" No one moved. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't look anywhere. The wagon creaked under the weight of his silence and hers. She climbed in without command, settling on the rough boards like she was used to it, like being handled and hidden was just the shape her life had taken. Samuel climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked once. The horses stirred, and the town fell behind them like an old regret. They rode in silence, the dust from the wheels choking the road behind them. Townsfolk pretended not to watch. A few boys ran behind the wagon until Samuel gave them a single glare over his shoulder. That was enough. His ranch hands waited at the bend, loading salt and sacks of corn into another cart. When they saw the woman seated in the wagon bed, sack still on, their eyes flicked, quick, uncertain, like they'd seen this before but weren't sure if they were meant to remember it. One of them, Tom, nodded once. Samuel didn't nod back. No words passed between them. The road wound through hills, past a broken windmill and a grove of bone-dry trees. Crows watched from the branches, still and silent. As they neared the old chapel, long burned and now half swallowed by thistle, the woman lifted the edge of the sack with 2 fingers, just enough to peek. She let it fall again. By the time the ranch came into view, fencing slouched like tired shoulders, the barn leaning westward, and smoke curling from a chimney that hadn't seen joy in years, she had not spoken, nor had Samuel asked. He stopped the wagon near the well. Climbed down. Waited. She didn't move. He didn't offer a hand, only stepped back and let her decide. Slowly, she climbed down, one boot touching the dry earth, then the other. The sack stayed on. The wind lifted the hem of her dress. She reached for the water bucket and drank, head tilted, sack still obscuring everything above her chin. Samuel watched her for a moment longer, then turned toward the house. She followed. The house creaked under its own memory. Floorboards that hadn't groaned in years suddenly remembered how. The porch swing, long still, moved slightly in the breeze. The woman stopped at the door, waiting for permission. Samuel opened it and stepped aside. Inside was dim, not dark, not dead. Just waiting. He showed her to the spare room. It smelled of cedar and dust. The bed was made, though the sheets had yellowed from age. A folded quilt waited at the end, stitched by someone with small hands and a steady rhythm. There was a silver brush on the table, engraved with initials she couldn't yet see. A shawl hung on the wall. A pair of boots beneath the window. Nothing had been disturbed. Samuel said nothing. He set down a small box, filled with bandages, soap, and 2 boiled eggs. Then he left. The door didn't lock behind him. The woman stood alone in the room, the sack still over her head. Her breathing was steady. She touched the quilt. Then the rocking chair. Then the brush. And finally, she reached up and untied the knot at her throat. She didn't take the sack off. Not yet. She just loosened it. Let the cloth shift with the breath of the room. Let her presence settle like dust on old wood. Outside, Samuel lit the lantern on the porch and sat beside it. The sky was turning. The wind had changed. But inside the house, The woman stood still, wrapped in everything she could not say. Not yet. But the silence between them had already begun to speak. The room stayed quiet long after the door clicked shut. She stood just inside the threshold, sack still resting loosely over her head, hands twitching near her sides like they didn't quite know what to do. The air in the room held something fragile, not dust, not stillness, but something else. Like the hush before a storm or a hymn whispered through grief. The bed was made too neatly, the corners sharp as folded paper. A bowl of water sat on the windowsill, steam long gone. Beside it, a bar of soap wrapped in yellowing linen. A silver brush lay on the dressing table, its handle engraved with letters worn soft from years of touch, A.G. She stepped forward with caution, each footfall silent on the wood. Her fingers brushed the edge of the quilt, then trailed along the frame of the narrow rocking chair. It creaked, just barely, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. The sack stayed on. Down the hall, Samuel stood in his kitchen, watching the kettle come to a boil without ever reaching for it. The fire beneath it was strong, but his body felt cold. His hand rested on the back of a chair that had sat empty for 7 years. There had been a time when Ayanna hummed in that kitchen, grinding corn with slow patience and soft breath. She never raised her voice, not even when the cattle scattered during lightning or when his hands returned bloodied from fence repairs. Her presence had always been gentler than the wind itself. Until the night she bled out on that very bed. She'd clutched his wrist as her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with apology. Like she was sorry she wouldn't get to see the child grow. He'd buried them both beneath the cedar tree. No headstone. Just a braid, buried in her palm, and a small medicine pouch from her tribe tied to the roots. After that, Samuel locked the room. Told himself it was for dust, for memory, for some quiet form of decency. But it had become more than a room. It had become a sealed wound he learned to walk around. Now, that door had opened again. And the sound of a stranger's breath filled it. The woman inside the room moved to the window. The sack shifted slightly as she tilted her head toward the moonlight, but she did not remove it. The silhouette of her shoulders was thin, not fragile, but drawn in tight, like a body preparing for more pain. Her hand reached toward the shawl hanging on the wall. She didn't take it down. Just touched it once, gently, as if asking permission. Night thickened outside. Coyotes cried somewhere past the hills. Wind rattled loose shingles on the barn roof. Inside, the house felt more like a church. In the dim light, the woman finally sat down. Her fingers found the knot beneath her chin. Slowly, she began to untie it. She didn't pull the sack off all at once. She loosened it with care, like she feared what might escape, not from the cloth, but from her own silence. Then, when it slipped off, she set it beside her on the bed without looking at it again. Her face remained hidden from view, turned toward the shadows. But her hands, pale and marked with old bruises, reached up to the back of her head. There, she found the beginning of her braid. She tugged the tie loose and began to unwind it. The motion was slow, deliberate. Not nervous, not mindless. It was the ritual of someone who hadn't been allowed to touch her own hair in weeks, maybe months. The braid fell apart like a stream breaking free from stone. It slipped down her shoulder, long and dark and tangled at the ends. She combed it gently with her fingers, and with every pull, something softened in her posture. Down the hall, Samuel had not moved. He stood beside the cold kettle now, unmoving, as if rooted to the spot. In his mind, the sound of braided hair unraveling filled the air. A memory of fingers weaving through his wife's braid at night, tighter when storms came, loose when laughter returned. But there was no laughter in this house. Only the sound of breath behind a bedroom wall. He did not go to her. Did not knock or ask questions. He knew too well the kind of silence a person needed to survive. Words had failed him long ago, at graveside, at childbirth, at every turning point where comfort could have helped. He wasn't about to offer noise now. Inside the room, she lay down without blowing out the lantern. Her eyes stayed open. The braid lay beside her like a line drawn between two lives. She did not cry. She did not speak. But she did sleep, eventually. A light sleep, the kind a woman learns after too many nights not knowing who will open the door. Outside, the wind settled. The house, though unchanged, felt different. Not warm, not healed. But not dead either. Not anymore. The first drop landed like a warning, thick and solitary on the tin roof, echoing across the rafters. Then another. And another. Until the sky cracked wide open, and rain poured like spilled memory. She stood alone in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands busy with the rhythm of survival. The knife in her grip worked slowly through turnips, each slice falling into the iron pot with a soft wet sound. Her fingers didn't shake, though the wind outside howled like something trying to get in. She didn't flinch when thunder clapped overhead. The fire was steady in the stove. Her eyes flickered toward it, then back to the pot. There was no recipe. Just instinct. Salt, onions, a bit of meat from the cellar. Enough to feed two. She hadn't asked. Just prepared it, because her hands still remembered what care looked like, even if her voice didn't. The door opened hard against the wind. Samuel stepped inside, soaked through, hat dripping, coat clinging to his frame like wet hide. He closed the door behind him with effort, water trailing from his boots to the kitchen floor. He looked like he'd walked through more than just a storm. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She placed a towel on the table and gestured toward it. He didn't thank her. Just took it in silence and wiped the mud from his face. The firelight softened him, made his features less carved from stone. She ladled stew into 2 bowls. Set them on the table without ceremony. Sat down across from him. For the first few minutes, only the storm spoke, drumming, pounding, shaking the windows as if trying to remind them both of something they weren't ready to name. She looked at him differently then, not with fear, but curiosity. As if seeing the man for the first time, stripped of rumor and distance. There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Did you ever love someone who wasn't yours?" The question came out like smoke, uncertain if it wanted to linger or vanish. Samuel reached to the wall and pulled his rifle from the hooks. Slowly, gently, like retrieving an heirloom. He laid it on the table between them, not threatening, just present. She looked at the stock, where the wood had been carved with care. A small eagle feather, delicate and deliberate, the lines deep with age. Her eyes widened, breath caught. "My uncle used to carve like that," she said. "He told stories with his hands." Samuel nodded. "She was Ayanna. From the Red Rock people. I married her under that tree behind the house." "The cedar?" Mara asked. He nodded. She traced the carving with her finger, not touching, just hovering. A sign of respect. And maybe of something else, something tender growing beneath the silence. "What happened?" she asked. "She bled too long. Our child never cried. The tribe doesn't speak to me anymore." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain poured harder, hammering the roof in waves. Yet inside the house, something stilled. The silence was no longer sharp. It wrapped around them like a blanket pulled just enough to cover two. Mara rose from the table and took the bowls. She moved quietly to the basin and began to wash. The sound of water over metal soothed the edges of the storm. Samuel watched her for a moment longer, then stood and returned the rifle to its place. As she scrubbed, he spoke, the words almost lost beneath thunder. "Not until they left." She turned. "What?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "I never loved someone who wasn't mine. Not until they left." Her fingers tightened around the bowl. She didn't smile. Didn't cry. But she nodded. Slowly. Like someone who'd heard a truth she wasn't sure she believed, but wanted to. The rain began to slow, losing its fury. The tin roof softened under gentler drops. The fire dimmed slightly, and the scent of stew lingered in the air, grounding, real, something made instead of taken. She stood at the window for a long time after he left the kitchen. Her reflection barely visible in the fogged glass. The name had been spoken. And the storm, at last, began to pass. Mornings came softer now. Mara rose before the sun most days, quiet as steam from the kettle, her feet bare against the wooden floors. She moved through the house like someone slowly relearning what it meant to belong to a space. Her hands were never still, they kneaded dough, stitched torn linens, swept the porch boards until they shone pale in the morning light. She tied her hair back again. Not the loose, cautious braid from that first night, but tighter now. Deliberate. The kind of braid that held shape. Each morning, she stood at the small mirror in the widow's room, parted her hair with her fingers, and wove it with calm precision. The end she tied with a thread of old leather, and each time she did it, something in her spine straightened. The men noticed. The ranch hands, especially. They kept their distance, unsure what to make of her. She was no maid. No wife. She did not smile at them, nor did she hide. They murmured among themselves, small comments about what they'd heard in town, about where she'd come from, what she'd been. Words like damaged and ruined passed between them, low and bitter. But when Samuel walked past and heard it, he stopped. He said nothing. Only stared. One look was enough to stop tongues from wagging. His silence, as always, carried more weight than any shouting might have. Mara noticed the quiet that followed, but said nothing. She kept baking. Her bread came out dense but warm. The smell filled the house, caught in the beams like memory. One day, while scrubbing the porch steps, her brush scraped against something hard beneath the stair. Curious, she leaned down and pried open the warped wood. Beneath it, tucked in cedar and linen, was a chest. She knew, even before opening it, that it had been packed with care. Inside lay a dress. White, but aged now to a soft cream. The beadwork shimmered still, faint and careful. The stitching was hand-done, uneven in places, but full of love. Ayana's wedding dress. She lifted it gently, fingers shaking. The fabric was softer than she expected. Heavy with memory. She carried it to her room, laid it out on the bed, and stared. The braid down her back felt too tight all of a sudden. She loosened it, then tied it again, tighter. The door creaked behind her, and Samuel stood in the threshold. He didn't step in. Just looked from the hallway, quiet as always. Mara's fingers traced the beadwork. "If I died here," she asked softly, "would you bury me in this?" Samuel looked at her, eyes shadowed beneath his hat. "Not until you lived first," he said. She didn't answer. But something in her face, the way her jaw unclenched, the way her hands stilled, said more than words might have. Later that week, a rider from town came up the trail, a preacher dressed too clean for weather, boots that had never touched mud. He knocked with the back of his hand, sharp and self-important. Mara was peeling apples in the kitchen. She heard him say her name. "She shouldn't be here," the preacher spat. "She's not a wife. You've taken a harlot into a widow's home." Samuel opened the door wide enough for the man to see the cold in his eyes, then slammed it shut. The preacher didn't knock again. But his words, once thrown, didn't disappear so easily. That night, Mara sat outside alone. The sky was clear, the stars sharp. She had her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the braid undone, trailing loose and dark over her back like a stream that had lost its course. The rocking chair creaked beneath her. Slow, soft. The wind tugged at her braid. Her fingers pulled at it absent-mindedly, unweaving what she'd worked so hard to tighten that morning. Inside, Samuel didn't come to her. But she knew he had heard. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to. The night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried out, not hungry, just lonely. She stayed outside until her fingers went cold, then rose and returned to the room that no longer felt entirely borrowed. The dress stayed folded on the bed, untouched but not forgotten. A relic of a woman who had loved this place once. A woman who had braided her hair, too, and made her own quiet choices. Mara looked at the mirror and saw herself. Not as she had been. But not as she was, either. Somewhere in between, braid half done, half undone. Still becoming. The frost hadn't melted yet when Mara stepped outside, apron tied tight and boots damp from the well path. The sun was still low, just a faint glow behind the hills, casting long blue shadows across the ranch. The air smelled of dirt, pine, and ash from last night's fire. She heard the sound before she saw him, the dull thud of wood, followed by a sharp curse under breath. Out past the chicken coop, near the lower fence line, Samuel stood with one boot braced on a rotted post, mallet in hand. He worked without rush, coat unbuttoned, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. His breath fogged in the cold. When he shifted, she saw the blood, not much, but fresh, red, trailing down the back of his left hand. By the time she reached him, he was still gripping the post, jaw clenched, a long wooden splinter lodged deep beneath his thumb. She didn't speak. Just knelt and gently reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. She cradled it in her palms, steady as prayer, and used the tip of her apron to clean around the wound. Her fingers worked carefully, brow furrowed, breath slow. When the splinter came free, he let out a hiss, then exhaled. She wrapped it in cloth torn from her own hem. Tied it tight, but not cruel. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, not heat, not longing. Something quieter. Older. The kind of closeness that didn't beg to be named. He nodded once. Back inside, the house was warm with wood smoke. She lit the stove again, ground the coffee beans in the small tin grinder by the window. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and dark. Samuel sat at the table, watching her. She didn't glance at him. Just moved with the kind of grace that wasn't taught, the kind born from routine, from knowing what needed doing. She poured the coffee into 2 mugs, his old one, the one with the dent near the lip, and another she'd begun using quietly each morning. He took his with his good hand. As she stirred her own, the spoon clinking gently, he said her name. Mara. She looked up. He didn't say anything else. Just let it rest there between them, like something too important to dress with more words. The moment passed like a breeze, gentle but sure. Later that evening, the fire crackled low in the hearth, long shadows dancing on the walls. Mara sat on the floor near the flames, knees tucked beneath her, brush in hand. She ran it slowly through her hair, careful and measured, as if each stroke undid a knot from some other life. She began braiding it, not quickly, not tight. This time, there was no hiding in it. Each motion was deliberate. She didn't face away from him. Samuel sat across from her in the armchair, the old shawl draped across his lap. Ayana's shawl, woven in cream and sky blue thread, the edges beaded with small glass charms that shimmered faintly in the firelight. He held it with both hands, thumb brushing the fringe. After a while, he stood, stepped forward, and held it out to her. No words. Mara paused, hands mid-braid. She looked at him, then at the shawl. Her fingers reached out slowly. When she took it, her hands trembled. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the fabric falling soft over her chest and arms. It didn't feel like stealing. It felt like being allowed to stand where another woman once had, not in replacement, but in quiet continuation. She finished her braid with the shawl draped around her like warmth returned. Neither of them spoke for a long time. That night, as the fire died low and the corners of the house darkened into quiet, Mara stood in the doorway of the main room. Her hair was still braided. The shawl still on her shoulders. Samuel sat at the table, writing something into a small ledger. His hand, now bandaged, moved slowly across the page. "Would you still have taken me," she asked, voice soft but clear, "if I'd screamed or begged?" He set the pencil down, looked up. "I saw your silence," he said. "Not your shame." She didn't move. But the part of her that had been waiting for him to see her as more than what had been done to her, that part finally exhaled. She stepped back into the dark of the hallway. In her room, she set the shawl neatly over the rocking chair, then climbed into bed. Outside, the stars hung steady in the black. And for the first time since she arrived, she dreamt without running. The news came on a whisper, carried in the mud-slick boots of a ranch hand returning from town. He said the man had a mouth too loud and a laugh too mean, and that he'd been boasting about selling the same girl twice and getting whiskey for both trades. Mara had been hanging laundry when she heard it. Her fingers stopped mid-pin, the sheet twisting in the wind like a ghost trying to flee. She didn't say anything. But her body went still. Her eyes didn't blink. Samuel was sitting by the barn, whittling the edge of a broken gate plank. When the ranch hand finished speaking, he stood, slow and sure. He didn't ask Mara a single question. Didn't press her with why or how or when. He just walked to the shed. Inside, he sharpened his knife on the whetstone, slow circles, edge to edge. The sound was steady, like rain on a tin roof. He checked his rifle, ran cloth through the barrel, loaded it with care. When it clicked shut, the sound echoed in the quiet. He took the saddle from its hook. No rush. No rage. Just a quiet readiness, like the kind that belongs to men who've buried too many things and learned to carry grief in their spine. Mara didn't try to stop him. The tavern sat on the edge of town like it had always been waiting for trouble. Lamps flickered in the windows, and the air inside was heavy with smoke, sweat, and men with nothing to lose. Samuel pushed the door open and stepped inside. Conversations slowed. One by one, chairs stopped rocking. The man at the bar, thick-necked, drunk on his own cruelty, turned and sneered. "Well," he said, slurring, "if it ain't the rich ghost come to collect what ain't his." Samuel didn't answer. He walked to the bar, reached into his coat, and placed something on the wood. The silver coin. The same one he'd raised at the auction block. Still tarnished, still carrying the weight of choice. "That wasn't a purchase," Samuel said. "That was a promise." The man snorted. "Promise of what?" "A used-up girl who—" He didn't get to finish. Samuel's fist landed clean across his mouth, not wild, not angry, just final. The man hit the floor hard, bleeding from the lip, more stunned than hurt. Samuel didn't draw his rifle. Didn't shout. He leaned in close enough for the man to smell pine and blood and winter. "You will never say her name again," Samuel said. The tavern was silent. He picked up the coin and left it on the bar. Not for the man, but for the barkeep, who'd seen too many men talk too much. Outside, the wind had picked up. It pushed dust across the empty road like old ghosts sweeping through. By the time Samuel returned to the ranch, the sun had dipped low behind the hills. Shadows stretched long across the fields. Mara was by the fire pit. In her hands was the sack. The one that had once been tied over her head, heavy with silence, stained with dust and breath and captivity. She dropped it into the fire. It curled fast, folding in on itself, the edges burning black, the cloth shriveling like a dead snake. No ceremony. No words. Just ash and flame and finality. She watched it burn until there was nothing left to look at. Then she turned. Samuel was waiting in the field with 2 horses saddled. No wagon. No speech. She walked toward him, Ayana's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her braid long and full, tied with a new strip of leather. She held no bag. She carried nothing with her. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then she mounted the horse beside him. They rode together without words, side by side, the hooves beating slow across the earth. The wind met them like an old friend. The sky opened up wide and gold. There was no destination. Only the ride. And in that ride, in the dust, in the silence, in the way her shoulders sat straight and his rifle rested unloaded, there was something close to peace. Not a love story. But something better. A survival remembered, side by side.